They called her the First Lady of Country Music, a title that sounds polished and ceremonial, like something designed for trophies and magazine covers. But Tammy Wynette was never born into anything that resembled elegance or ease. Long before the gowns, the spotlight, and the roar of applause, she was a voice shaped by endurance. A voice that didn't just perform heartbreak but carried it, like it had been living with it for years. What made Tammy different wasn't just how she sang, it was what she sounded like when she did. There was a weight in her voice, a quiet ache that felt less like performance and more like confession. When she sang about loyalty, loss, and impossible love, people believed her because she wasn't imagining those feelings, she was remembering them. Her songs would eventually become emotional landmarks for millions of women who felt trapped between hope and disappointment, between devotion and self-preservation. But that authority didn't come from success. It came from the long road that led there, a road filled with poverty, early responsibility, broken promises, and the constant fear of everything falling apart. Even at the height of her fame, Tammy never fully escaped that world. The pain didn't disappear, it simply changed its shape. Behind the perfectly arranged hair and the controlled grace of her public image was a woman who had packed her children into a car with no money, no guarantees, and no backup plan, chasing a future she could barely imagine. This is not the story of a perfect star. It's the story of a woman who survived long enough to turn endurance into music and pain into a voice the world would never forget. Tammy Wynette was born Virginia Wynette Pugh in rural Mississippi, a place where life was measured less by dreams and more by survival. Her father died when she was still an infant, leaving behind little more than a few musical instruments and a family already stretched thin. Her mother, forced to work to keep going, made a decision that would quietly shape Cammie's entire childhood. She left her daughter in the care of her grandparents, and Virginia grew up not in comfort, but in cotton fields. From the time she was old enough to walk, she was old enough to work. The days were long, the heat was unforgiving, and the labor was endless. She would later say she hated picking cotton, not just because it was hard, but because it taught her early that nothing in life came gently. Childhood, for her, was not a protected space, it was responsibility. Music entered her life quietly, almost by accident. She learned piano and began singing gospel at church, forming a small duo with a school friend and performing wherever they were invited. Sometimes it was a church gathering. Sometimes it was a local radio appearance. But even then, music wasn't a dream. It was simply a refuge. She was bright, athletic, and popular in school, even making the state basketball team. But stability never lasted long. When her mother remarried and became more involved in her life, their relationship grew tense. Tammy was stubborn, restless, and already looking for a way out. She didn't know where she was going yet. She only knew she didn't want to stay where she was. By the time she was 17, Virginia was already trying to escape the narrow boundaries of her world. Like so many young women who grow up too fast, she confused leaving with becoming free. She married young, convinced that love, or at least change, would be enough to build a different life. Instead, she found herself pregnant and struggling almost immediately, trading one kind of hardship for another. Marriage did not bring stability. It brought bills, exhaustion, and the constant anxiety of not having enough. Even when her husband found work, the money never seemed to stretch far enough. Tammy did what she had always done when things became unbearable. She worked. She studied cosmetology, tended bar, and did whatever she could to keep her small family afloat. There was no safety net. There was only effort. But effort wasn't enough to fix a marriage that was already cracking under the weight of youth and pressure. When the relationship finally began to collapse, she packed up and moved to Birmingham, hoping distance might offer clarity. Instead, it offered only more work and more waiting. She enrolled in beauty school again, convinced that a practical career was the responsible choice. Singing was still something that happened in between everything else, a way to release stress, a way to breathe. She didn't yet understand that music wasn't just a comfort. It was the one thing that refused to leave her, no matter how hard she tried to live without it. It was in Birmingham that music began to push its way from the background into the center of her life. Almost without meaning to, Tammy found herself singing wherever she was allowed. A local television appearance led to another, then another. At the time, she was still juggling everything at once: beauty school during the day, salon work for barely enough money, and early morning performances that left her running on exhaustion more than ambition. She was pregnant again, and the cameras only filmed her from the waist up, as if even her circumstances had to be carefully hidden. She still didn't think of herself as a future star. Singing was simply something that made the weight of her life feel lighter for a few minutes at a time. But in 1965, a trip to Nashville changed the temperature of her dreams. The city felt alive in a way nothing else ever had. It wasn't just the music, it was the sense that this was where people came to begin again. She tried one last time to repair her marriage, but when it failed for good, she stopped waiting for permission to leave. In January of 1966, she loaded her 3 daughters and everything they owned into a car and drove toward Nashville with no money, no connections, and no plan beyond hope. It wasn't courage so much as necessity. Staying had become impossible. Nashville did not welcome her with open arms. It barely noticed her at all. Tammy and her daughters stayed in cheap motels, counting every dollar and measuring every decision. She began performing wherever she could, often alongside musician Don Chappell, traveling through small towns, singing for rooms that didn't yet know what to do with her voice. He tried to help her find a record deal, but every door seemed to close before it ever really opened. One label after another said no. Some said she didn't fit. Others said there was no place for another woman singer. It was the kind of rejection that sends most people home, but Tammy had already burned her bridges. There was no home to return to. Eventually, she was introduced to producer Billy Sherrill at Epic Records. He wasn't immediately convinced, but when she sang, something changed. There was a rawness in her voice that couldn't be trained or manufactured. He told her she needed a new name, something that sounded like a star. He looked at her and said she looked like a Tammy. And just like that, Virginia Pugh became Tammy Wynette. Her first recording, Apartment No. 9, wasn't a massive hit, but it was enough. Enough to prove she belonged, enough to keep the door from closing. She had finally stepped inside the industry, but the hardest part was still ahead. Success did not arrive gently. It came all at once, and it demanded everything. In 1967, Tammy released Your Good Girl's Gonna Go Bad, a song that sounded like both a warning and a confession. It shot up the charts, and suddenly her name was everywhere. Almost overnight, she became the voice of women who were tired of pretending they were fine. That same year, duets and solo hits followed in quick succession, and each one felt less like a performance and more like a page torn from someone's real life. Then came Stand By Your Man. Written quickly, almost casually, it became anything but. The song exploded across the world, turning Tammy into a cultural symbol as much as a star. Some heard loyalty, others heard surrender, but everyone heard conviction. The song didn't just define her career, it defined how millions of people saw her. Awards followed: the Grand Ole Opry, Grammys, #1 records. She was no longer just successful, she was the center of country music's emotional universe. And yet, even as she stood at the top, her private life was beginning to fracture in ways no audience could see. At the height of her rise, Tammy found herself drawn to someone who understood fame's pressure and its poison better than anyone else. George Jones was already a legend, and just as famously, a man at war with himself. Their connection was immediate and overwhelming. They recorded together, fell in love, and married in 1969, becoming country music's most celebrated couple almost overnight. On stage and on record, their voices fit together like they had been waiting for each other. To the public, they were a fairy tale. Their songs sounded like promises. Their tours felt like events. Their bus even carried the title everyone believed, Mr. and Mrs. Country Music. But behind the curtain, the story was darker. George's drinking turned their life into a cycle of apologies, disappearances, and fear. The love was real, but so was the chaos. They fought, they separated, they came back together. And through it all, they kept recording, turning their private pain into some of the most haunting duets the genre had ever heard. Songs about holding on, about not letting go, about loving someone you couldn't save, suddenly felt less like fiction and more like confession. By the time they finally divorced, the marriage was over, but the emotional wreckage and the music it created would follow both of them for the rest of their lives. After the marriage ended, Tammy had to learn how to stand alone again, both on stage and in life. At first, audiences didn't know what to do with her without George Jones. Some even called out his name during her shows. But she kept going. She reshaped her concerts, leaned into gospel and ballads, and in time found her footing again. When she released Till I Can Make It on My Own, it didn't just top the charts, it told the truth. It sounded like a woman teaching herself how to survive all over again. But survival had a cost. Years of touring, stress, and physical illness left her in constant pain. Surgeries became routine, so did prescription medication. What began as treatment slowly became dependence. Even as her chart success faded in the 1980s, she kept recording, kept performing, kept showing up, sometimes needing oxygen backstage just to finish a show. In the 1990s, she surprised the world one more time, first with a nostalgic reunion alongside Loretta Lynn and Dolly Parton, then with an unlikely global hit that introduced her voice to a new generation. But her body was failing. On April 6, 1998, Tammy Wynette died in her sleep. She was only 55. What she left behind was more than a catalog of songs. She left a voice that told the truth about love, endurance, and the quiet strength it takes to keep going. She didn't just sing heartbreak, she translated it. And in doing so, she became something rare, not just a star, but a witness to the lives of millions.